you for joining us.
Go ahead, Jenna.
Thank you for joining us this morning. We're happy you're all back. Many of you have joined Dr. Suzy before, and we're happy you're back again with us. So Dr. Suzy, some of you are well aware of her from our last session, but we welcome her back with the Muslim Foster Care Association again. You know, Dr. Suzy is the founding director of Cornerstone, which is a nonprofit, a faith-based or a communication and intervention organization with several locations around the world. It focuses on youth, family, marriage, identity, socio-emotional wellness, and relationship building. She has traveled to the border of Syria and has worked in refugee camps with women, families, youth, orphans, and continues her work with resettlement and relief agencies, providing a lot of integration intervention. So we welcome her back to speak to you about a very important topic on nonverbal communications as it relates to Muslim refugee foster youth populations. And thank you, Dr. Suzy, for coming back and doing another session, which we are really excited about. So thank you for joining us this morning.
All right, thank you so much, Shona, and thank you so much, Shireen. I'm happy to be here with everyone. I was looking at the names of some of the participants. Some of the names look familiar, some not so much. So before we get started, because I did want to build upon some of the topics that we talked about in the last session, I just want to get a sense of how many of you attended the last session. So maybe you can do the little hand raised icon in the screen, and that'll give me a sense. Okay, so I'm not seeing any hands raised. So did anyone attend the last session that we did for the Muslim Foster Care Association? I believe it was last month. I think it was like January 25th or so. Okay, I see one yes in the chat box, and I see about 2 hands or so raised. Okay, great. So we do have 3 hands. Okay, so we have a couple of newcomers. I'm thinking I will do my best to kind of give a recap maybe of some of the things that we talked about in the last session that kind of bleed into this session and that we're going to build upon. So in the last session, we had talked a lot about collectivism and the impact that collectivist cultures and collectivist worldviews have on transitioning, particularly for refugee youth, and what the experiences may be like transitioning from a collectivist community or collectivist culture and entering into the US, which is a highly individualistic culture. And we had left off last time, actually, right when we were going to come into the discussion or the conversation about how many of the collectivist elements that are part of a collectivist worldview often show up in nonverbal ways, and how we as caregivers, as service providers, can become better attuned with how to connect and how to communicate with the children and the youth and the minors that we foster, particularly those coming from Muslim and refugee backgrounds or forced migrant backgrounds. So I kind of gathered a few of the slides that we did not have time to cover in the last session to start us off with, and then kind of work our way through them towards better understanding nonverbal communication, and particularly from the Muslim refugee foster child perspective. So I think the question that we often ask when we are communicating with anyone from a different culture, a different generation, a different background, even if we have our own biological teens, for example, sometimes it seems like we're speaking 2 completely different languages because the worldviews, the experiences, what they are bringing to the table may be very different than what we've experienced in our worldviews and where we're coming from. So a lot of times we think of communication as common sense, right? I say something, you hear it, you respond to it. But if it were that easy, we probably wouldn't have all of the difficulties that we see in relationships and in the myriad of relationships that we have that occur because of difficulties in communication. And I will tell you, for those of you who know a little bit about Cornerstone, you know that we have 5 different divisions at Cornerstone. And our refugee intervention integration division is just one part of the Cornerstone services we provide. But one of our largest departments is our marriage and family department. And in our marriage and family department, we help individuals who are struggling with marital problems, with problems in parenting, with problems in connecting. And I would have to say that the number one reason why, when we may ask people, okay, what's going on? Why is there difficulty? Why is this marriage on the brink of divorce? Why has this child left the home? Why are difficulties occurring? And so often the response will be miscommunication. So clearly communication is not as common sense or as easy to convey or to grasp as we sometimes think. Now, particularly when we're adding layers of differences in that aspect of communication, we can see that more and more difficulties can arise. So many of you are probably familiar with the idea of the U-curve of culture shock. And, years ago, it was believed that when someone entered into a new culture, a new dynamic, a new situation, that they would experience what was described as the U-curve. That in the beginning, that when they first arrive, and if we take, for example, the refugee community, particularly minors or children who are coming as forced migrants, the arrival period is considered the honeymoon period, the period in which there may be a sense of excitement, a sense of like newness. Maybe there is, we talked last time a little bit about the triple trauma paradigm and the fears and the baggage and the emotion that may come with the individual in that entering into that new culture. But in that process of entering into that new culture and that new space, in the beginning days, we tend to see that sense of excitement and maybe that newness of the situation. Now, with the U-curve concept, we see that reality can set in relatively quickly, and that reality can be tinged by frustration. It can be, stressors. It can be mental health issues that we're going to talk about a little later. Generally speaking, we would anticipate then a period of recovery or adjustment, and then ideally with the U-curve, we get to a place of adaptation and a place where the person is well connected and comfortable in the culture. But we know that it's not quite a U-curve, that what we see, particularly in the communities that we serve, that it's much more like a W. That just like when we think that maybe we are out of the stage of crisis, when we think that maybe the child has adapted, that maybe culturally they have connected, maybe linguistically they are more comfortable, we tend to see after that peak that may arise, we tend to see again periods of frustration, periods of difficulty. And when we talk about the W, we talk about deep dips in the W, that it might not just be a little bump, but we may see periods of intense crisis. And these periods of intense crises may actually be occurring, several months after the child has entered into the new country or the new culture. They may be occurring several years after entering into the new country or the new culture. So the U-curve of culture shock is not quite as linear maybe as we'd like to think of it, as it's one and done, right? But we tend to see this consistent pattern where there may be moments of adaptation and adjustment, and then we may again see moments of crisis and then recovery, and then again, kind of this process that occurs. So preparing ourselves and better understanding what's to come is important in how we communicate. Last time we had talked a little bit in our session about when we send a message and when we convey words, how often we think that what we're saying is what the person we're talking to is hearing. And we use the example of a tree. Since we have lots of new people in this session, when I say the word tree, I want you to just drop in the little chat box, and I have my chat box open, the type of tree that comes to mind. So I said the word tree. As soon as I said tree, just jot down in the chat box the kind of tree that you might have thought of. Okay, so someone said pine tree, oak tree, apple tree, another pine tree. Okay, all right, so a lot of times, again, cherry tree, willow tree, maple tree. All right. So a lot of times when we say a word as simple as tree, right? The type of tree that I was thinking of was a palm tree, right? And other people said the tree in the photo, a banyan tree, right? So lots of different trees that come to mind. I was thinking of a palm tree because it's actually freezing in New Jersey today, and we're expecting snow, and I'm just like thinking of warmer weather. And that was the image that came to my mind. But in codifying the word tree, I simply said tree. When each of you came to decodify that tree, you decodified it from your perspective, meaning the person who said willow tree, maybe, Teresa might have had a willow tree in her backyard when she was growing up. And so when she thinks of tree, that's what she sees. The person who said maple tree, maybe they had pancakes for breakfast and put maple syrup on it. And so that's what came to mind, cherry tree, pine tree, so on and so forth. Every time there is a message that is sent verbally as well as non-verbally, we decodify that message based on our own perspective. And so when we are communicating with the children that are within our foster care, that we are providing services to, who are coming from a different country, different experiences, different culture, different linguistic background, imagine the steps of codifying and decodifying that are occurring in order to process information. If between us, who maybe most of us are very familiar with the US, maybe most of us grew up here or lived here for quite some time, we said a word as simple as tree, and yet we got so many different responses in terms of what that tree looked like in our mind. So keeping that in mind, it's important to recognize why communication is not such like a straight line, linear, direct form of giving information or guidance. Because we, of course, have the sender, which is you initiating the communication. You are going to have your own communication skills, your own attitude, knowledge, social system, culture. The message itself is going to have a certain type of content, elements as part of that message, a treatment of that message, the structure of it, the codes, the channel it's sent through. This is the nonverbal aspects. How is the person hearing those words? How are they seeing it? Is there touch involved or haptics? Is there an element of taste or feeling? So there's different channels by which we're conveying. And then on the opposite end, the receiver is also going to have their own communication skills, attitude, knowledge, social system, and culture that's going to play into the interpretation. And when we think about the message and the content codes and structure of the message itself, if we just think back to our own childhoods, right? And I will tell you, growing up, so I grew up in the 80s. I'm sure many of us have in this group. And back in the 80s, right, there was a popular Michael Jackson song that had come about, might have been the early 90s, actually. But the song was called Bad. I don't know if anyone remembers that or not. But, during that time, the word bad, right? And the word, when you look at the denotative definition of bad, it means something negative, right? But the word bad had taken on the connotative definition of something cool. So I remember growing up, my sisters and I would always, like, anything that we liked, we'd be like, oh, that's so bad. Yeah, that's bad. And my parents, who had immigrated here from the Middle East, were always like, why are you calling it bad? If you like it, call it good. It's not bad if it's something that's good. And so we see that the content of the message changed based on the intention of the sender and the interpretation of the receiver. And so when we think about communication in this way, we begin to recognize, again, the layers of meaning that are embedded in the words that we use, and also in how we use those words and how we convey them. So it's important for us to recognize that with that how, there's also a very deep intentional emotional component that can be integrated in our communication. I love that somebody in the chat said that her son uses the word sick to refer to something that's really awesome. Yes, I remember when my kids were growing up, they're much older now, but fat was in, PHAT, right? Something good was the PHAT, fat. But there's also an emotional component, even with all of these words, right? So when a younger generation utilizes a word in a certain way, like bruh, right? If you teach high schoolers or teenagers now, everything is bruh, right? It's not even bro, it's bruh. But there's an emotional component in that the utilization of those words creates a sense of connection. And that's why language is so powerful, because a lot of times it's through our languages, both verbally and non-verbally, that we create communities and that we create connections. Now, in our last session, we had talked a little bit about universal emotions, and we talked about the 6 universal emotions and how every culture and every country and every background exhibits those 6 universal emotions similarly. So happiness across cultures is exhibited with an upward movement of the lower facial muscles, or, when you tell a child to draw a happy face and they draw the smile upwards, that's indicative of that upward movement. Sadness is a downward movement of the lower facial muscles. So even though the exhibition of these emotions are universal, the situations in which the emotions occur are different. So again, I had used the example last time of a study we had conducted where children were asked to identify which emotion was indicative of a specific situation or how they would feel in certain scenarios. And one of the scenarios that we used was a child playing with his sibling, and if a vase or something expensive that belonged to the parents had broken, and the parents came down and yelled at the child, even though the sibling was the one that broke it. And invariably, we saw in the collectivist communities, children that were coming from collectivist backgrounds, that the image of the emotion that they held up was one of sadness. But the one that individualist community children had tended to hold up was the one of anger. And so despite having similar nonverbal markers for specific emotions, situationally, emotions may manifest differently. And we talked a little bit about how trauma can impact the way that the emotional output is conveyed, that often trauma is masked as anger. And so, the child who gets very angry because, the book bag that they wanted, that was, they wanted the red color, but instead they got the blue color, that the response may be one of very intense anger, and that intense anger may not be aimed towards the fact that the color of the book bag is not what they wanted, but it may be an outpouring of being able to channel emotional trauma towards something tangible, because it's so hard to dissect the emotion that is intangible, emotion of feelings of loss, of feelings of loneliness, of feelings of lack of connection, of feelings of missing family, that trauma of war. And so it becomes channeled as anger, even though the emotion that we would normally have anticipated in that situation would be sadness maybe, or the emotion we would have anticipated maybe could have been a little bit more on the lines of frustration, but it might manifest differently. So how do we get better at understanding emotions and non-verbally recognizing how to respond to those emotions, and really understanding the cultural implications, also recognizing that so many of the young people that we serve do come from collectivist backgrounds? So first of all, we want to work on eliminating our own ethnocentrism, that regardless of how we may think we're not ethnocentric, naturally human beings do tend to be ethnocentric in that we view the world from that which is most familiar to us. Again, think of the tree example. We think of the tree that is most salient, most relevant to us, to our thoughts, to our experiences. And one of the great ways to work on eliminating ethnocentrism, two ways actually, is through nonverbal immersion. So really being the fly on the wall and watching nonverbal cues to better understand individuals' responses. And also through nonverbal immersion, understanding ethnographies. For those of you who may be in the sociology field or may have studied anthropology or cultural anthropology at any point, you may be familiar with the concept of a cultural ethnography. This here is an example of a cultural ethnography that I think really helps highlight the idea of ethnocentrism. This was an ethnography that was written by Horace Minor in the 1950s. And Horace Minor was a cultural anthropologist who studied different cultures. And he would study them by, taking a step back and just reporting what he saw. And he would try to not make any judgments. It was just simply a straight report. This is what I see, and I'm describing what I see. So he studied a culture known as the Nasarima. And this was again in the 1950s. And I'm just going to read a couple of the sentences. I know there's a lot up here, but I also have the link that you can check out later on because I think it's a fascinating study that everybody should read. So Horace Minor describes the Nasarima. He says, the Nasarima culture is characterized by a highly developed market economy, which has evolved in a rich natural habitat. Then he talks about certain areas of focus that this cultural community tends to have. So he says the focus of the Nasarima is the human body, the appearance and health of which loom as a dominant concern of the people. While such a concern is certainly not unusual, the ceremonial aspects and associated philosophy are unique. The fundamental belief underlying the whole system appears to be that the human body has a natural tendency towards debility and disease. Man's only way of avoiding these characteristics is through the use of ritual and ceremony. Every home has one or more shrines devoted to this purpose. While each family has at least one such shrine, the rituals associated with it are not of family ceremony, but are private and secret. The rites are normally only discussed with children and then only during the period when they're being initiated into these aspects. The focal point of the shrine is a box or chest, which is built into the wall. In this chest are kept the many charms and magical potions without which the Nasarima believed they could not live. These preparations are secured from a variety of specialized practitioners. The most powerful of these are the medicine men. And then it goes on to describe the charm box. It goes on to describe the water that comes from the font, the rituals of cleansing. Then the ethnography continues by talking about the holy waters that are blessed ceremonially as well. And then he talks about different practitioners. He talks about the Nasarima have an almost pathological horror of and fascination with the mouth, the condition of which is believed to have supernatural influence on all of their social relationships. Were it not for the rituals of the mouth, they believe that their teeth would fall out, their gums bleed, their jaws shrink, their friends desert them, and their lovers reject them. The daily body ritual performed by everyone includes a mouth rite. This rite involves a practice which strikes the stranger as revolting. The ritual consists of inserting a small bundle of hog hairs into the mouth along with certain magical powders, and then moving the bundle in a highly formalized series of gestures. Then it continues, it describes, again, holy mouthmen, it describes the Latipso, it describes other types of rituals. In the end, it talks a little about this part of the rite includes scraping and lacerating the face with a sharp instrument. Special women's rites are performed only 4 times during each lunar month, but what they lack in frequency, they may make up for in barbarity. As part of this ceremony, women bake their heads in small ovens for about an hour. So if you could give me a word or two to describe what you just heard in the chat box, I'd appreciate that. So what we just read about the Nasarima, what do you think? What are your first thoughts about the Nasarima culture? Give me a word that describes how you see the Nasarima culture based on what we just read. Anyone? You could drop it in the chat box. Unique, very different than US or Western culture. Dangerous, isolated. Okay, good. So we've got a good couple of words there. Now I want you all to take a moment and read the word Nasarima backwards. What does it say when you read it backwards? You can put it in the chat box. American, exactly. So Horace Mayner was actually describing the American culture, but he was describing it from the perspective that we often use to describe cultures that are unfamiliar to us. So if you think about this from the American cultural perspective now, the obsession, for example, with ritualistic cleansing or the mouth, right? It's for us here in the US, going to the dentist, having white teeth, having straight teeth, the braces that we put on our children is something that we prioritize, which isn't necessarily prioritized in many other countries or cultures. Going to the doctor, there's a segment, if you read the whole thing, about psychologists and the strange culture of talking through your problems and how that's seen as very different. If you think about the 1950s, women baking their heads in small ovens. If you recall, I think they still have them in beauty salons, but those blow dryers that are kind of like round, hot things that you would put your head into. So when you look at the description of the Nasarima, you see this ethnocentric concept. When we didn't realize that it was the American culture, the description of some of the rites and the rituals, and of course, the rituals that were described in the shrines that were described were the bathrooms that exist in every home. They seem very strange. And a lot of times, without realizing, subconsciously, we allow our ethnocentric views to seep into our views of those who may be coming from different cultures. And we may feel that what it is that they are doing that is culturally important. For example, Islam as a religion, and many of the clients that we serve do come from a Muslim background or practice the Muslim faith. Islam as a religion does have several ritualistic aspects that may differ from Christianity or that may differ from Judaism. And those ritualistic aspects, include praying 5 times a day. They include praying at specific times. The month of Ramadan is almost upon us, and it's a month of fasting and at very specific times, from the start of dawn until sunset. And so we may feel, again, from an American perspective in which faith is practiced less ritualistically, we may subconsciously view some of these ritualistic aspects as being very different, very unique, very strange, and in many ways, even dangerous. And that's where we want to step back and we want to better understand the perspective. And yes, as Casper is saying, it is a parody of the American culture, and it's meant to show us kind of a glimpse of what we do sometimes. I remember growing up, my father used to collect National Geographic magazines. I don't know if they print those anymore or if you find them all online, but I remember they would come in every month and we'd be so excited, and we'd look at the cultures that were depicted in the National Geographic magazine with the same sense of awe and wonder. And it wasn't until years later, when I started to immerse myself in cultural anthropology, that I began to realize the way that, for example, the Wadobe tribe in Papua New Guinea, the way that they were captured in the National Geographic magazine made them seem very strange, very foreign. Whereas when you gain a greater understanding of what certain aspects or tribal elements or ritualistic aspects are, they're not quite as strange, not quite as foreign. So how do we connect with those that we are maybe fostering, caring for, providing service for, and feel more aligned, particularly culturally, when we come from such different cultures? We often talk about speaking the same tongue rather than speaking the same language. And we touched upon the topic of the 5 languages of love in our last session. I had mentioned that if you haven't had a chance to read Gary Chapman's little book, The 5 Languages of Love, I highly recommend it. And one of the things that we tend to identify is that here in the US, when we are working with children, when we are even working with adults, we strongly speak the language of affirmation. So we'll often say things like, good job, great work, you're doing wonderful, I'm so proud of you. And that may be the language by which we are trying to show a sense of connection. That's the tongue that we're using to connect with others. But what we tend to see is that for many individuals coming from collectivist community, and particularly young refugees, minors who are forced migrants, the languages that tend to be more prevalent are the language of service and the language of time. And we talked a little bit about the difference between polychronic and monochronic last time, the fluidity of time. And so the language of service, the child who you're saying, you're telling that child, come on, you can do your homework by yourself. I know you got this. You can finish it. Just if you finish it in the next 15 minutes, you can go outside and play, right? We're speaking the language of affirmation, and we're taking a monochronic view of time in that finish this, then do that. A child who's coming from a polychronic perspective where time is very fluid is not going to connect with that rigidity of time. They're also going to feel isolated. And we talked about that self-actualization, self-sufficiency last time. They're going to feel isolated when you are pushing them to complete the task by themselves. So viewing this type of moment of possible connection through the lens of service and time rather than affirmation, you might want to say, hey, do you need some help with that homework? Would you like me to sit beside you and work on that homework together? Let's see when we can, try to wrap this homework up, and then maybe we can play together. So giving a different view in how you connect with the individual. But it's not just in our languages of love that we want to speak the same tongue. Some of you may be familiar with a few different theories that relate to the linguistic perspective and the differences that we see across cultures linguistically. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis posits that our world is created by our words. But the theory of sociolinguistic relativity says the opposite. It's our words create our world. So what does that mean? For example, some of you may be familiar with the Inuit language, which is a language spoken by many native tribes in Alaska and a few other areas around the world. In the Inuit language, you will find that there are over 50 plus words, I believe, to describe snow. So there's a word for snow when a reindeer poops in it. There's a word for snow that, flakes that measure, I don't know, like 1 inch in diameter. There's a word for snow that is a slight pinkish in color, right? And they have all of these words for all of these different types of snow. But here in the English language, we have maybe like 3 or 4 words, right? We've got maybe sleet, maybe hail, maybe slush, right? But we don't have a word for when a reindeer poops in snow, right? We don't have a word to describe snow that is slightly pinkish in color. Now, if we were to follow the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that would say that it's because that type of snow doesn't exist. But according to the theory of sociolinguistic relativity, we do have snow that has a pinkish color, and we do have, snow that a reindeer poops in, but it's not important enough for us to label it. And so we don't have a word for it. So how does that relate to the children that we may be providing care and services for? So I'll give you an example. A few years back, I think it was in 2016 or so, we had many Syrian children that were refugees who came to the US and were enrolled in schools. And we were getting phone calls from a lot of schools that were telling us these children are racist. These children are acting in ways that's harmful to children from other cultures, other countries, other backgrounds. And so we entered into one school to work with the children where they were having some difficulty, in the adjusting and the adaptation. And so we spoke to the children. First, we spoke to the teachers, and the teachers said, well, this group of children in particular are getting into fights all of the time with many of our African-American students, and they refuse to call them by their names. They're consistently saying, black boy, you black boy. And so when we sat with the children who had come from Syria, the refugee children, and we were trying to explain to them, the teachers had tried many times to explain racism, to explain how this is not something that they should be doing. When we sat with them, we understood that for them, there was a fascination coming from a very homogenous community where they had never seen anyone with a skin color that was different than the color of theirs, coming from a community, as we talked about last time, collectivist communities tend to be highly contextual, meaning language tends to be very metaphoric and very descriptive. So coming from a highly contextual collectivist community that was homogenous in nature, seeing a child with a different color skin, it felt very natural for these children to call out the other child by the color of the skin, not because they were intending to be insulting, not because there was racism, in their perspective of their view, but because in their communities, in their culture, the words that were used to describe someone of another skin color was simply the color of that person's skin. And so the words that they were using, saying, oh, he's black, right? Here in our communities, we raise our children to recognize and understand that, we don't call someone by the color of their skin. We don't label someone based on what we visually see, right? But this was not the language that they were coming from. So there was a huge divide there in terms of their understanding and what it was that they were conveying. I often tell my own kids, for instance, growing up again in the 80s, on the school playground, we used to sing a song all the time. And the song was a simple one. It was, I'm so happy, I'm so gay, I'm so happy, I'm happy to be gay today. And, when I tell my children, they kind of like snicker a little bit and they're like, wait, that's such a weird song. Why would you sing that? Right. But we were utilizing the term gay in terms of the denotative definition, which was happiness. And so in utilizing that terminology, it was denotative, and the cultural understanding of that word was inclusive of what the word meant at that time. Now imagine today, if a child sang a song like that, it would have very different implications, and the meaning would have changed, not because the words themselves are different, but because the experience that the word is affiliated with or assigned to is now different. So sometimes it takes, a little bit of explanation and a little bit of guidance to help our children coming from different cultures who speak different tongues. Again, not necessarily different languages, because a lot of times we'll see our children who are coming from different countries and different cultures picking up the language relatively quickly, but the connotative meaning of the language can sometimes be lost. And, this is why a lot of times we'll hear curse words coming out from many of the young children that we work with, not because, they feel that these curse words are indicative of what they are feeling or capturing the emotion, but the word itself carries a different meaning or a different connotation in how they convey it. Now, we also know that it's not just the words or the meaning of the words, but how the words are conveyed. So when we look at the study of haptics, it has to do with touch. And, when we looked at those 5 love languages, we saw touch being one of those languages. Again, here in Western society, in our communities, it's very natural to, give children, a hug, to, pat them on the shoulder. And we know, of course, again, times have changed, right? 20, 30 years ago, it would have been completely normal, even less than that, maybe, to hug your teacher in school, right? For a teacher to pat a child on the shoulder. Today, as times have changed, and as we see the politics of touch being negotiated differently, there's hesitation. Maybe teachers don't hug children the way that they used to. Teachers don't necessarily put the hand on the shoulder the way that they used to. When it comes to haptics from a communication standpoint, we also know that haptics can be very much linked to trauma, and that sometimes the act of touch can actually induce or trigger or re-traumatize a child who has experienced trauma in the past due to touch. And so we want to navigate through touch very carefully. We also know that there's a whole slew of gender implications when it comes to touch. So someone coming from a Muslim background may feel comfortable shaking the hand of someone of the same gender, but may not feel comfortable shaking the hand of someone of the opposite gender. They may feel comfortable sitting next to someone of the same gender, but not someone of the opposite gender. So we want to be conscious and really be focused on what is the language of haptics and what is it saying to the child, and always deferring and asking, are you comfortable with this? Does this make you feel okay? And allowing the child also to take the lead. And this kind of links to mirroring expressions, which we had talked a little bit about before, that one of the best ways to learn how to speak the same tongue as someone that we're communicating with is to mirror the expression. So if a child is, standing a little closer to someone, recognizing that that's a cue for proxemics, that it's okay to, kind of close the gap of personal space, right? If a child is standing further away, then recognize that that might be a cue of asking for distance in terms of proxemics. The same thing with facial expressions, recognizing, if a child is telling a story and the face is sad and maybe is telling a story about, something that happened in school, if our nonverbal response is a big smile saying, oh, don't worry about it, it's not a big deal, right then and there, we've lost the empathy factor because we're not mirroring the expression. So instead of the expression on the face is one of lower facial muscles moving downwards, we want to mimic or mirror that expression and respond to the emotional cues. And our vocal variety is also a way to kind of break through the resistance when there may feel like there's an emotional divide. So if we are seeing, a child who lowers their voice and, maybe drops a few octaves, a lot of times in the classroom, we might see teachers where if a child is speaking in a low voice, that's like, raise your voice, I can't hear you. But that's not necessarily a mirroring of the expression. Instead, if the teacher were to pause maybe and to also drop the voice a little bit and say, it's difficult to hear when your voice is lower. Maybe you can increase the volume a little bit. We tend to see a more positive response. So the same thing with a child who may be angry, agitated, upset, and maybe that child is responding with a higher pitch, an increased, or more intense tone, an increased volume. If you're going to try to match that volume and the increase in the volume, you're probably not going to succeed. But if you pause, right, and you listen first to what the child may be saying or how they're conveying it, and then in mirroring the response, you may want to have a similar volume, but not a shouting match, right? So the volume might be, I hear you and I understand what you are saying, but I need you to lower the volume a little bit so that we can better understand each other. So that you're initiating with a mirroring of the expression, and then you're guiding the child to a safer place where the volume decreases. And it's amazing because you'll see the response in how the child will then mirror your expression, and you'll find that the volume drops a bit. So a lot of times what we're seeing externally is just the tip of the iceberg, right? We are seeing the behavior. And so many times we're trying to repair the behavior without recognizing all of the nonverbal elements that are taking place underneath the tip of the iceberg. And when we look at an approach to behavioral understanding and behavioral intervention that's known as the Satir transformational theory, we recognize that if we try to tackle the iceberg just at the tip, we're missing so much of what goes on in the bottom. right? That we are visually seeing the behavior, but we need to gain a better understanding of what's informing that behavior, what thoughts may be informing that behavior, what feelings, what expectations, what values, what yearnings, what view of self, and so much more that goes into that. And we had talked a little bit in the last session about Bronfenbrenner's ecological system and the way that we often go directly to the individual rather than looking at all of the other systems, the macro system and the exosystem and the mesosystem. And that's just like this. The behavior is the microsystem. If we focus just on what we're seeing at the tip, we're going to miss a lot of what's happening underneath that. So what do we do to try to understand the nonverbals that may not be showing up in what is being conveyed verbally or physically or behaviorally? So the narrative theory proposes a way of approaching and gaining a better understanding in terms of communication that's really all about story building. Remember, we talked about collectivist communities being highly contextual, using lots of adjectives, being descriptive. And so many times, in order to better understand what a child from a collectivist community is coming from, particularly a child who has endured great trauma, you want to build the story with the child. And so that means, you may see behavior that is not aligned with what you are expecting, or, something like time. We'll use that as an example. So the child who is, never on time for school, who, they have a doctor's appointment and they just won't leave the house on the right time. They don't finish their homework on time, right? Recognizing that this may not be a behavioral issue of I don't care or school isn't important to me, but that it may be linked more to the polychronic and monochronic views we've talked about before. Having the child create a narrative collaboratively, and a lot of times it requires visualization and thought mapping to guide the child towards being able to unpack what it is that may be deterring them. And in so doing, we might find that it's just the view of time is different, that the way that the child sees time is different than the way that you see time. And so being able to work together through that narrative approach can help us with that unpacking. Now, there's another theory or another approach that really helps in deciphering the nonverbal, particularly for children who are forced migrants, who are coming from collectivist communities and engaging in fostering here in the US. This is known as the Bowenian theory. And this is a theory of triangulation, meaning that when we look at any family unit where there are maybe children and adults in the situation, we look at it in the form of a triangulation. And that most children that have been removed from their family of origin or who are not engaged with their family of origin will identify within this triangulation a differentiation of the self. Meaning you've got this triangle kind of dynamic in the family, but the child may see themselves kind of at the tip of the triangle, completely almost linked with a very thin thread, I would say, to the other corners of the triangle. And in that triangulation, a lot of times you will see the child trying to form almost a triangulation with other individuals, maybe with friends, maybe with distant relatives, maybe with other sources or coping mechanisms that are not the most helpful or that are not the most beneficial. And many times, these forms of coping mechanisms that may be negative are linked to struggles of identity. Issues of identity where a child is struggling maybe in understanding where they fit into the dynamic of their lineage, trying to reconnect with their parental roots, feelings of detachment from culture, from community, feeling so uprooted from collectivism, experiences of both social dysphoria and gender dysphoria. We tend to see this more often now among youth who are coming as forced migrants into the country because of difficulties in that attachment and being able to connect in the new community. Crises of faith identities and feeling like there is a difference in terms of how they practice their faith or who they are from a faith perspective. Cultural and linguistic identity. We talked about the differences in the tongues that we speak and how they're conveyed. Issues of sexual orientation and identity. We are also seeing these issues of identity and these struggles among youth at large, throughout the US, but also with many of our refugee youth that are resettling here in the US. We also see difficulty in terms of the view of gender. And we also see that for many of the refugee children that we care for and that we provide services for, coming from collectivist community, there is a very binary view of gender. So if we go back to the theory of sociolinguistic relativity, for example, the child who in the high school classroom or the college classroom is asked to identify his or her pronouns, right? Or has a friend who identifies, themselves with the pronouns of they or their, right? That can be it can cause a great cognitive dissonance within the child, not being able to grasp this non-binary view of gender. And we see that this non-binary view of gender can cause, for many children who have not grown up in a culture or a society or a community in which gender was viewed as non-binary, or that there was possibilities of non-conforming when it comes to gender, that this can also cause difficulty in adaptation and difficulty with identity as well. And it's a hard subject to talk about. It's a hard subject to talk about because many of us don't have the tools or the understanding to talk about it, because even generationally, it's a different view of gender, for example. There's a different view when it comes to sexual orientation, where the conversations about sexual orientation are much more prevalent in society today than they were 20, 30 years ago, where many of us were growing up maybe. So realizing that there's these differences that exist, and that the way that we talk about these differences also needs to align with that pathway of connection. Many times when we're working with children, we tend to take either an empathy-oriented view or an action-oriented view. Again, when we see children who have experienced great trauma, have gone through difficulty, and are adapting to a new country or new culture, we tend to see that they are more goal-oriented in terms of how they want someone to listen, that they want an action plan. There is a problem, they want a solution. But here in the West, in individualistic communities, we tend to actually be more empathy oriented. We tend to say, oh, you don't feel good? Oh, let me give you a hug. Let's talk about it. Whereas someone who is more action oriented may want a plan. They may want you to say, okay, you don't feel good. You didn't do well on your math exam. Here's what we're going to do. So there's a difference in how we listen and how we connect with the children that we serve. I'm noticing that we've only got about 10 minutes left or so, and I do want to have time for Q&A. So I'm just going to go through a few more quick slides again. I promise I cut back on my slides this time, and we're still running out of time. I just want to quickly just touch on some of the aspects that we may be seeing non-verbally from a mental health standpoint as well, because this is also a huge part of what we're dealing with when we are fostering children who are refugees, who've gone through the triple trauma paradigm we talked about last time. We know that many times we're quick to label. So there can be varying degrees of negative emotions maybe, or emotions towards a negative experience, and there can be varying degrees in the intensity of them. We tend to be very quick to label, and sometimes we'll identify sadness and call it depression. We'll identify grief and call it depression. We'll identify sorrow and we'll call it depression. We'll identify frustration and we'll call it anxiety. We'll identify anger and we'll call it ADHD. So many times we smack labels on emotions that may not fully align with those labels. So we want to be cognizant of the emotion that's being expressed, and we want to give the children that we care for the space to explain that emotion, and to be able to help them through the narrative approach to collaboratively kind of create the stories to explain the emotion that they're feeling and to explain what that emotion is linked to, rather than just quickly labeling with a specific diagnosis. With that said, we also know that there are certain mental health outcomes that we tend to see more prevalently among children who are refugees or forced migrants, and particularly those who are in foster care. We definitely see more of PTSD cases. We do see more BPD1 and BPD2. OCD behaviors tend to be very prevalent, particularly the behavior of scrupulosity, which is a type of OCD behavior that is ritualistically linked. Meaning, for example, I had mentioned prayer in the Muslim faith, and we know that prayer is something that is done 5 times a day. We also know that prior to prayer, there's a process of ablution. It's a cleansing process, washing of the hands, the face, the nose, the feet, and things of that sort prior to prayer. we tend to see a lot of children who have gone through intense trauma, refugee children who are coming from Muslim countries, exhibiting scrupulosity, where they may, perform this form of ablution consistently over and over and over again. And a few years back, we had a young adult, and he's allowed me to share his story without his name. We were seeing him, it was back in 2014, 2015, I believe. We were seeing him because he had come to the US, he had done really well in school. I think he had come in maybe his senior year or so. He had gotten a job at a local hardware store, had been doing really well. And suddenly we were receiving reports from his employer that he wasn't, showing up at work. He'd disappear for hours on end. His family was worried about him, saying he was spending hours in his room. Something had changed. And when we had a session, one of our interventionists had a session with him, we learned that, again, through unpacking trauma and through memory mining exercises, exercises that resisted re-traumatization, that was trauma-informed care, of course, we found that while he was in the hardware store, while he was on a ladder at one point, he had seen someone wearing army fatigues walk underneath the ladder, and he had looked down at this person, and that had been a trigger that caused a memory that he had buried years before to resurface. And it was a memory of him as a child. He had been raped by army officers that had entered into the home, and he had buried this memory and had not brought it back to the surface until that moment in which it was re-triggered. And so after that re-triggering, he had run to the bathroom and felt like he wanted to do ablution, the cleansing of the self prior to prayer. But every time he would do it, he felt that he wasn't clean enough. And so he kept doing it over and over again. So during work, he would spend hours in the bathroom, just constantly doing the ablution over and over again. At home, he would do the ablution. He would go to pray. He'd feel like he was unclean. So he'd go back into the bathroom and do the ablution. And this form of scrupulosity, we see it again in different forms, but this is just one example. Thankfully, he did agree to speak to a psychiatrist. He was able to get on medication and continued with talk therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy that helped him. And, thankfully he's doing really well now and has kind of the OCD behavior under control. So being aware of how trauma can impact and being aware of nonverbal cues that may show us that something is going on. And those nonverbal cues may be seen in behaviors that are indicative of mental health struggles. They may be seen in unhealthy coping mechanism behaviors. So if we are recognizing that someone is clearly turning to, particularly a child or a minor, to an addictive behavior, and the addictions don't have to be, marijuana or cocaine or LSD, or we tend to see a lot in terms of acid these days. It could be other things, addictions to pornography, addictions to gaming, food addictions. And a lot of time when there is trauma that is linked to a loss of food or a fear of not having enough food, that we will see issues with eating and eating disorders that appear. Other behavioral addictions that may occur. So being aware that, again, trauma can manifest non-verbally and knowing how to talk about that trauma. And I'm going to give you these slides as well. I'm sure the group will share them with you. So you can kind of read through about how do we talk about the hard topics, especially when we may not be speaking the same tongue, and learning how to speak the same tongue so that we can convey what needs to be conveyed. We also want to make sure that we are maintaining our credibility as the caregiver, right? And there's different forms of credibility, but one of the most important ways of maintaining our credibility is avoiding logical fallacies. And again, I'm sure you're familiar with some of these red herrings and slippery slopes and bandwagons. We tend to use these logical fallacies when we don't want to give a long explanation to a child, but they're definitely more harmful than helpful in terms of how we communicate. So we know, again, our nonverbal cues, how we stand, how our posture is, whether or not we're open in terms of our hands can definitely convey different messages to the children and those that we provide care and service to. We also know the way that words are processed can be different. And if we take a look at this image, for example, This was an image that was taken within a few seconds when somebody was reading a scenario to this teenager. And if you look at, just number 9, it looks as if by the time the person finished reading it, the teenager was like, seriously, like you just wasted my time. But if you look at, number 3 or number 5, there were other nonverbal cues being exhibited throughout the reading of the scenario. A lot of times we only respond to number 9. So knowing how to listen non-verbally as well as verbally is important in how we communicate and how we connect. So I'm going to wrap it up with the last aspect that I wanted to share today. For those of you who are not familiar with a grounding technique or a mindfulness technique like the 5-4-3-2-1 method, this one is a super powerful one that seems to work across cultures. When there is a sense of anxiety, frustration, anger, big emotions, right? A large emotional response. It's often because the thoughts in our mind are rushing faster than we have time to process them. And in that rush, we want to slow those thoughts down. And one of the best ways of doing it is by engaging the 5 senses. So being able to pause and reminding those who we are providing service to or that are in our care to stop and just look around and identify 5 things they can see. Then identify 4 things they can touch, 3 things they can smell, 2 things they can hear, and then 1 thing they can taste. And that tends to bring a greater sense of calm to whatever the situation is in that moment. So I am going to wrap it up here. And again, we got through more slides than last time, so this is a positive, but I'll wrap it up here. And maybe we have like 5 minutes or so left for some questions. So I don't know if we're taking verbal questions or just in the chat box or what the best way to do this is.
Thank you so much, Dr. Suzy. If anyone wants to just go ahead and put their question in the chat or unmute themselves, feel free to unmute yourself, even if it's not a question, just a comment or anything that you would like to have feedback for. Someone said they're ready for session 3, Dr. Suzy.
One of these days, I'm going to have just the right amount of slides and I'm not going to like rush through.
All right, I'm guessing there aren't any questions. Oh, there's one in the chat right here. So you mentioned about Muslim youth perhaps only wanting to shake hands with someone of the same sex gender. Does this hold true for hugs, or is hugging not a norm no matter who the other person is?
Yeah, great question, Heather. I appreciate you asking that. So it's actually any form of touch from the opposite gender. When we see, for example, if you even, the stereotypical movies that showcase the Middle East, for example, or Southeast Asia, you'll often see that the greeting of salam between 2 males or 2 females involves, a hug, a shake, a kiss on either cheek. But for a male greeting a female or a female greeting a male, there is no touching. So it would be really the boundaries of no touching of the opposite gender at all. So yes, hugging is included in that. And I should probably just clarify that this is generally speaking for someone past the age of puberty. So you have a child, a 5-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old, regardless of the gender, they're usually, comfortable with, a hug, a pat on the shoulder. But again, we're also talking about children who have experienced great trauma. And anytime, we want to deliver trauma-informed care, we do want to take that moment to ask first, is it okay for me to hug you? Or would you like a hug right now? Or can I touch your shoulder? And it may not seem like the most natural thing because we may be comfortable, hugging or grabbing or tickling children when we're around them as an expression of love. But again, part of the cognizance of, speaking that same tongue is also taking the time to be aware and to just get that acquiescence before crossing any boundaries. All right, so I think it's exactly noon. So
Thank you so much, Dr. Suzy, again for joining us. Thank you everyone for joining this session. And if anyone has any questions or any feedback, they can always email us at the MFCA email that I'll put in the chat, and we can get those questions over to Dr. Suzy, and we'll be sharing the slides and the recording from this session as well. So thank you so much again for your time, Dr. Suzy, and thank you everyone for joining. And I hope you guys all have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Suzy.
Thank you.
Thank you.